right. Thank you for the introduction. So now you know probably a lot more than you wanted to know about me. Sorry about that. So I thought we'd start out by kind of moving forward and talking about this storm that I would imagine most of you probably remember. How many of you were here in Florida for Andrew? 1, 2, 3. So, okay, so probably about 30% of the audience. How come you stayed? Or you weren't in Homestead, were you? You were in Homestead? No? Anybody in Homestead during that storm? So we all remember that was kind of our wake-up call. We hadn't been hit, this country hadn't been hit by a really big hurricane in a really long time. And that was a huge wake-up call, and Andrew changed everything about the way that we do business now when it comes to hurricanes, about the way buildings are built and that they need to withstand Category 3 hurricanes. This was the last Category 5 to make landfall. Now, we've seen a lot of Category 5 since Andrew, but this was the last one that made landfall in the United States. All right, Hurricane Sandy. Just a couple of years ago now. I'm originally from Staten Island. That's my mom in the front right there. And she was there during Hurricane Sandy. Now, Hurricane Sandy technically wasn't even a hurricane when it came on shore, technically. But what happened with Hurricane Sandy was it merged with the jet stream. So this was when it was still a hurricane off of the Carolina coast, and there was a strong jet stream coming around, and those two systems merged. But Hurricane Sandy was the perfect storm because it came on shore during high tide and during a full moon, and it came on shore at that right angle where New York City is. How many of you are from the Northeast originally? Right, because everybody who lives in this part of Florida is originally from the Northeast or New York City in some way, shape, or form. You're a Met fan? You're a Met fan, right? I know, I'm kidding. I see your hat and your shirt. I'm a Yankee fan too. Well, Hurricane Sandy was an amazing storm in that it was only a Cat 1, but its storm surge was equivalent to what we would call in the South a Cat 3 or even a Cat 4 in some cases. And that's because it was such a huge storm, and it came into New York City at that angle. It was coming up the coast, it made a left hook, and all that water from Long Island and all that water from the Jersey Shore just came right into Raritan Bay into New York Harbor and caused all that flooding. How many of you were here during this storm? All right, this was a storm that directly impacted us here in South Florida. It was a very big storm, as you can see. And also the eye was very big, so the strongest winds were fairly far away from the actual core, the center of the storm. And that was, believe it or not, the last hurricane to hit Florida. Now, during 2004 and 2005, I think we had 7 direct hits from hurricanes in the state of Florida. But then you go 9 years, and we haven't been hit by a hurricane in the state of Florida. And not only that, Wilma was the last major hurricane to make landfall in the United States. Major hurricane being a Category 3 or greater. And by the way, Hurricane Wilma, when it hit us, was a Cat what? It's Cat 2. It was a Cat 3 when it came on shore around Naples, but for the most part, the winds that we had were Cat 1, Cat 2 winds. We didn't see a real Category 3, and also it came from the wrong direction, right? It came from, let's go back. It came from the Gulf of Mexico. Had it come in from the southeast, it probably would have been even more impactful here in South Florida. All right, so we do have hurricane climatology. If you look back to the 1920s, there weren't that many hurricanes. There was a big uptick in the amount of hurricanes, and this, I believe, is number of hurricanes and major hurricanes. During the 1940s and 1950s and into basically those 2 decades right there, there was a big uptick in the amount of hurricanes, and strong hurricanes as well. And then in the 1980s, you might remember, there weren't really that many storms into the early 1990s, and then another big uptick. So right now, we're in this cyclical pattern, and we're in an uptick part of the pattern. Some meteorologists kind of argue that there's a chance that we're now on our way back down again. That would be wishful thinking. Usually these cycles last anywhere between 20 and 25 years. Our cycle started in the mid-90s. So therefore, we are approaching the end of our up cycle, it seems. All right, so when in a hurricane season do we see the most storms? Well, the max is right around September 10th. That's when we see the most amount of activity in the Atlantic Ocean. All right, it's going to be hard to see, and actually it's hard for me to see, so I'm gonna head a little closer. So this gives us an idea of what the return period is in years for hurricane-force winds. The highest numbers are down in the Keys. It's tough to see. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. Go back a little. And it's somewhere around, I believe, every 5 or 6 years down in the Keys. And those numbers go up a little bit as you head up the coast, but not too much more. As you can see, pretty much all of South Florida, the return period for a major hurricane is around 15 or 20 years or so. And the return period for a hurricane is only 5 to 7 years. It's been 9 years since we've seen a hurricane in the state of Florida. So obviously, you might say that we are due at some point for another hurricane hit. And this is a map that shows you the hurricane hits per county in the United States. And obviously, South Florida is the bullseye for that. This, by the way, is inland Monroe County, which really is, this is also Monroe County, which is the Florida Keys. Obviously, the Florida Keys stick out a little bit more, so they get hit a little bit more by hurricanes, and that's just a closer view of the hurricane strikes per county. Okay, so let's talk about what's happening this year. This is a look at the sea surface temperatures, or really it's the sea surface temperature anomaly. Blue stands for cooler than normal water, and yellow stands for about average or slightly above normal water. As you can see, in the Gulf of Mexico right now, water temperatures are just slightly below normal. Down in the Caribbean, about normal. Just to the east of the Bahamas, slightly above normal. Now, this is a look at the eastern Atlantic Ocean. A lot of our what we call long-track hurricanes, and those typical hurricanes that we think about that form near the Cape Verde Islands, which those are the Cape Verde Islands right there, that just off the African coast. These are the ones that we look at as the really strong hurricanes that they have, and we watch them for a week, week and a half, because it takes them so long to get from Africa across through the Lesser Antilles and to the United States. So these are the monsters. These are the ones that we really look to. Well, look in the eastern Atlantic right now. The water temperatures are either at or slightly below normal. But the Pacific Ocean temperatures, and this is important, are slightly above normal. If you look at the equator, just off of Ecuador, just to the south of Central America there. If you look, you can see all this blue water to the south of the equator, but at the equator, there's a strip of warmer than normal water. So why is that important? Does anybody know why that's important? You can shout it out if you know why. El Nino. All right, so it looks as though an El Nino is forming, and the way we know that is we look at the Pacific Ocean. Surface waters there are a little bit above normal. Surface waters in the eastern Atlantic a little bit below normal. So that would bode to a probably quieter than normal season. Of course, we're hoping, but it doesn't mean much because we say this all the time, but all it takes is one storm. Andrew was a year with only 6 or 7 storms, and Andrew was the most powerful hurricane that we've really seen here in South Florida in a very long time. All right, so this might be slightly complicated. All you need to know is that below the darker, the more solid black line right there are negative El Nino conditions, and above it are positive El Nino conditions, or sea surface temperature anomaly in the Pacific Ocean. In degrees Celsius, by the way, because meteorologists like to confuse things and do everything in Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. But as you can see, all of our, and by the way, every single line that you see there that's coming out from the dot, those are computer models that we run. And every one of them has slightly different math, slightly different physics, and it gives us an idea of what that computer model thinks the water temperature is going to be over the Pacific Ocean. Every single one of them, basically, for the most part, except for maybe one of those, show an El Nino. And some of them show a pretty strong El Nino. In fact, there are a lot of climatologists and meteorologists who specialize in this that think this might be one of the strongest El Ninos that we've seen in over 100 years. Comparable to the one that we saw back in the late 1990s. I think it was 97, 98. So what does El Nino do? Well, first of all, El Nino is warmer water. You can see that tongue, if you will, of warmer water in the Pacific Ocean off of South America. Now, if we look back in the history of tropical seasons in the Atlantic Ocean, the average number of storms is 9.4. So on average, we'd see about 9.4 named storms. On average, we would see 5.8 hurricanes, on average, we'd see 2.5 intense hurricanes. Look at the El Nino average. During El Nino years, and this one should be an El Nino year, we average about 7 tropical systems, named systems. We average about 4 hurricanes, and we average about 1.5 intense hurricanes. So obviously, during El Nino years, you can see that climatologically speaking, we typically see less than normal storms. If you look in the Pacific, it's actually the opposite of that, and the reason is because, well, the water is warmer in the Pacific Ocean. So why would El Nino correspond to a weaker than average season? Well, the explanation's right on the bottom. El Nino releases a lot of heat into the atmosphere, a lot of energy into the atmosphere, and that strengthens the jet stream in the Pacific Ocean, which then travels across into the Atlantic Basin. By the time it gets into the Atlantic Basin, we have strong upper-level winds. So everyone having lived here in Florida for probably quite a while, you've heard us use the term wind shear. You've heard us use that word, wind shear? Well, wind shear destroys or disrupts tropical systems from forming. So the stronger the wind shear, the stronger the jet stream, the better chance that you are going to slant the thunderstorms. And once you slant the thunderstorms, they become less organized and the whole system becomes less organized. Okay, so now this right here is basically all the tracks in the Atlantic Ocean, Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, in El Nino years, neutral years, and La Nina years. And this is an illustration again of El Nino. During El Nino years, it's top right. You can see there's a lot less tracks than, let's say, during a La Nina year where there are a lot of tracks, and also neutral years where there are a lot of tracks. So you can see by looking at this graphic that during El Nino years, we tend to see a lot less tropical systems. And so it brings us to Dr. Gray's forecast for the year. I was in South Padre Island, Texas, about a month ago when they released this forecast. Dr. Gray was there, and his predecessor was there as well. And if you look, the amount of named storms that they're forecasting are 9 this year, and the average is 12. So it pretty much corresponds with a typical El Nino year. The amount of hurricanes, the average is about 6.5. They're predicting 3. And the amount of major hurricanes averages a little over 2, and they're predicting 1. So the moral of the story is most of the meteorological community think that this is going to be a weaker than normal season. But who remembers the forecast from last year? Does anybody remember what was being forecast last year by, you remember? Oh, 5 minutes. Well, most of the hurricane forecasters, if not all, were forecasting a very active season last year. And it turned out to be a very quiet season. So, you know, I don't believe in long-range forecasting. I don't do long-range hurricane forecasting. Because in the end, does it really matter if we see 2 hurricanes or we see 20? What matters is does it make landfall in the United States, in a populated area, and more specifically for you, does it impact us locally here? And I'll tell you, we cannot tell you 2 weeks, a month, 3 months, let alone 6 months out where these storms are going to travel. We cannot tell you in any way, shape, or form. So sometimes hurricane forecasts are very misleading. We want people to keep their guard up and be prepared every year, regardless of how many storms we think there may be. Whoop, hold on. All right, so that leads us to this one here. It only takes 1 storm, and that's Hurricane Andrew back in 1992. We talked about that at the beginning. Hurricane Andrew was the storm that changed everything. And it was during a year where we had very few tropical systems. Winds in Hurricane Andrew were 165, gusting higher than that. All right, oh, by the way, one more thing I want to mention. What's going to be really helpful from the National Hurricane Center is they have a new product this year. Every time they predict the path, a new path comes out from the National Hurricane Center, they're going to be also running a storm surge model. It's going to be unbelievably helpful to us meteorologists. So every time they project a new path, which is every 6 hours or so, they're going to be running a computer model to show what the inundation, the saltwater inundation will be. And that is going to be put out all the time, so we have an idea of how much storm surge will be caused by a storm that might be moving in a certain path. And that is really impactful because, believe it or not, it's storm surge that causes about 50% of deaths in hurricanes if you look back in the history of tropical systems. All right, thank you, everybody.